Libya, December 1941. The sun rose over the endless Sahara like a burning blade, cutting the sky into white fire and golden dust. Inside a cramped metal shell coated with sand, a young British tanker named Corporal Jack Havers squinted through his periscope. The world outside shimmered in heat, distorted, unreal, like a mirage built on fear. His vehicle, the brand-new American-built M3 Stuart, groaned beneath him, its thin steel hull vibrating with every rev. It wasn't the kind of tank that inspired confidence. It looked small, almost cheerful, with a rounded turret and high tracks. More like a mechanical beetle than a machine of war. To the Germans, it was a joke. They called it the American cricket or the paper tank. Even British crews nicknamed it Honey, not out of affection, but irony. Sweet to drive, but not to die in. When they rolled into the North African theater for the first time, the men of the 4th County of London Yeomanry could hear the laughter on the radio intercepts. Mocking reports from Rommel's Afrika Korps that described these little toys wandering in the desert like lost children. And in the first clashes, the mockery seemed deserved. The M3 Stuart was fast, yes, blisteringly fast across open ground, but its 37mm cannon might as well have been a pea-shooter against the thick hides of the German Panzer III and IV. Its armor was barely over an inch thick in places. Its engine roared like an airplane, giving away its position long before it arrived. Inside, temperatures reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews passed out from the heat, the smell of fuel and sweat hanging like a death shroud. And when enemy shells struck, they didn't always penetrate, but they rang, vibrating through the hull like a church bell of doom. That first week in Libya was brutal. Jack remembered his first engagement like a fever dream. The sandstorm whipping sideways, the radio crackling with half-heard orders. When they crested a ridge near Ajdabiya, they saw them. The silhouettes of Panzers, neat, organized, confident. The British opened fire, their 37mm rounds sparking harmlessly off enemy armor. The reply came instantly. German shells slicing through the air with a sound like ripping cloth. One hit an M3 ahead of Jack's position. The Honey burst open, flames licking out from its turret. The smell of burning oil and flesh mixed in the wind. They laughed at us, Jack muttered years later. And for a while they were right. By evening, half the squadron was gone. The survivors limped back to base at Tobruk, morale sinking with the desert sun. In the officer's tent, there was shouting, British commanders furious that their new American machines were failing in their baptism of fire. "We can't fight iron with tin," one of them spat. "We need grants, not toys." But the truth was, this was what they had: light tanks, fast, fragile, and underestimated. And somewhere amid the smoke and the despair, a dangerous idea began to form. A few weeks later, the Desert Rats, the hardened veterans of the Western Desert Force, received a small batch of Stuarts. They'd fought Rommel's Panzers for months and learned one brutal lesson. In the desert, brute strength wasn't enough. The landscape punished the heavy and rewarded the cunning. So they decided to treat the Stuart not as a tank at all, but as a predator. Not a lion, a jackal. Small, fast, opportunistic, lethal only when unseen. Jack's new commander, Major Bill Cotton, explained it during a dusk briefing. "You don't fight the Germans where they are," he said, pacing before the glowing map lit by lantern light. "You fight them where they're going. We're not the hammer anymore. We're the knife in the dark." The men exchanged skeptical looks. They'd seen what German tanks could do, but Cotton's tone left no room for argument. "Speed is armor now. Surprise is your gun." That night, the crews modified their vehicles. They removed unnecessary gear, painted over shiny markings, and adjusted the radio channels for direct platoon coordination. Something the Germans hadn't yet perfected. The desert wind howled through the camp, rattling the thin steel sides of the Honeys like the breath of fate itself. The first test came days later. At dawn, under a blood-orange horizon, Cotton's small unit of 6 M3 Stuarts moved silently across a dry wadi southwest of Mechalai. The plan was insane: ambush a German supply convoy. The Stuarts hid behind sand ridges, engines off, crews sweating in silence. Jack's hands trembled on the gun controls. The radio hissed with static. Then the sound of engines. Through the haze came a column of German trucks and 2 escorting Panzers. They rolled with mechanical arrogance, dust curling around their tracks. Cotton's voice whispered over the radio, "Wait for the 2nd Panzer now." Jack's gunner squeezed the trigger. The 37mm roared. The first shot missed. The second hit the Panzer's fuel drum. The explosion tore the silence apart. The convoy scattered. Men shouting, gunfire lighting up the dawn. The Stuarts darted from cover to cover like wasps, firing and retreating, their small size making them ghosts in the dust. Within minutes, both Panzers were burning. When the smoke cleared, the men just stared. 6 toy tanks had destroyed a force 3 times their size, without a single loss. They didn't cheer. They just looked at each other, silent, almost unbelieving. News of the raid spread fast. The mockery faded, replaced by wary respect. German officers began reporting unexpected speed attacks by light tanks in their communiques. The British High Command took notice. The Americans, too. And within the sand-scoured world of the desert rats, a shift had begun, from humiliation to revelation. Yet that morning, Jack stood on the ridge and stared at the smoke curling over the horizon. The desert shimmered again, endless and empty, but somehow different. He realized that nothing had changed about the tank itself, only the men inside it. The same thin armor, the same small gun, the same roaring engine. But now it carried something the enemy couldn't measure: audacity. Still, the laughter wasn't gone everywhere. In Berlin, a propaganda broadcast sneered, "British troops now fight with American toys. Perhaps they will soon send dolls." The German radio announcer chuckled. Jack listened from the wireless tent, the sandstorm howling outside, and smiled for the first time in months. "Keep laughing," he said quietly. "We'll see who's still laughing at Gazala." The desert wind carried the sound of engines, the metallic heartbeat of war. The Stuarts rolled again across the dunes, their tracks carving scars into the sand. In the distance, thunder rumbled. But it wasn't weather. It was the sound of tanks, hundreds of them, converging. Something was coming, something bigger than any man or machine. And soon, the world would learn that in war, the smallest engine of change often begins as a joke. They called it a toy. They called it weak. But the desert was about to prove them wrong. The desert had no mercy. It devoured machines as easily as it swallowed men. The M3 Stuart might have survived the laughter, but now it faced something far more lethal: the truth of North Africa itself. Engines choked on sand. Radiators boiled over. Gearboxes seized in the heat. In the no-man's land between Gazala and Benghazi, wrecks littered the dunes like bones of extinct beasts. Burned-out crusaders, shattered grants, and yes, more than a few broken Stuarts. Corporal Jack Havers knew every rattle and groan of his tank by now. The honey, as they still called it with bitter affection, shook like a living creature whenever it climbed a ridge. Inside, the noise was constant. Gears grinding, shells clinking, the radio hissing. The air was thick with sweat and dust. His crew's faces were burnt and crusted white from the salt of evaporated perspiration. They drank from canteens that tasted of metal and desperation. When they weren't fighting the Germans, they fought the sun. But the M3 was a stubborn little beast. Its engine, an aircraft-derived radial, screamed like a banshee but kept running. Could go where heavier tanks couldn't, skimming across soft sand that bogged down the Panzers. Its small size made it nimble, almost mischievous. Yet its thin armor meant one mistake, one overexposed ridge or moment of hesitation, and they'd be vaporized. Major Bill Cotton had been right. "Speed is armor," he'd said, and now that lesson became gospel. The desert rats learned to fight like ghosts, never where the enemy expected, always moving, never staying still long enough to be bracketed by artillery. They discovered the desert's rhythm, how the sun blinded optics at dawn, how shadows hid their tracks at dusk. Still, the cost was unbearable. During January, Jack's squadron lost nearly half its tanks, not always to enemy fire. The sand wore them down like glass paper. The filters clogged faster than the mechanics could clean them. Once, While crossing a dry wadi, the left track of Jack Stuart snapped clean off. The heat shimmered. Flies swarmed. They were stranded. Hours passed before a recovery truck found them, and even then they had to abandon the tank overnight. When they returned at dawn, the Germans had shelled it to slag. That night in the mess tent, Cotton slammed his mug down. "We're dying from the wrong enemy," he growled. "This heat kills more than Rommel." But amidst all the loss came something new: adaptation. The British tankers, used to fighting in Europe's hedgerows and mud, began thinking like desert hunters. They stripped their tanks of side skirts to reduce weight. They carried extra fuel in jerrycans lashed to the back, water bottles tied like trophies. They used the landscape itself as armor, hiding in wadis behind dunes, in the folds of shadow cast by moonlight. The Americans who had built the M3 hadn't imagined this kind of warfare. They'd designed it as a scout, a light companion to heavier formations. Yet here, in Africa's burning crucible, the Stuart was evolving. One afternoon, during a lull near Gazala, Jack and his commander were visited by an American liaison officer named Captain Evans, a tall man with oil-stained hands and an engineer's curiosity. He crawled all over the Stuart, taking notes, asking questions. "You boys really fight in these?" he asked incredulously. "Fight?" Jack grinned, knocking the side armor with his knuckles. "We make the buggers dance." Evans frowned, running his hand along a patched section of hull. "She wasn't built for this kind of punishment." "No," Jack said quietly. "But neither were we." Evans stayed for days, watching their maneuvers, recording how the crews used radio coordination to outflank enemies instead of confronting them. It was a kind of warfare the manuals didn't teach: mobile, improvisational, chaotic. The Americans took notes. And though Jack didn't know it, those notes would later influence the U.S. Army's own tactics in Tunisia and Sicily. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was survival. In late February, Cotton's unit received new ammunition, tungsten-cored armor-piercing rounds. They were precious and few but deadly. During gunnery practice, one of Jack's shots punched clean through a captured Panzer plate at 400 yards. The crew cheered like schoolboys. Finally, their sting could match their speed. Days later, they put it to the test. It was just before dawn. The world washed in pale blue and silence. Their mission: ambush a German supply convoy expected to cross the Tri-Capuzzo Road. 6 Stuarts lay hidden among rocky outcrops, camouflaged with netting and scrub. The men waited, hearts pounding, listening to the wind sigh over the dunes. Then engines. Distant, low, rhythmic. Jack peered through his binoculars. Trucks. Fuel carriers. 2 Panzer IIIs. He could see the black crosses painted on their hulls. Major Cotton's voice came soft over the radio. "Let them come close. Wait till they're past the rocks. Then sting." The convoy entered the kill zone. Jack's loader rammed a tungsten shell into the breach. The smell of cordite hung heavy. His gunner whispered, "Got M." Cotton's command snapped, "Fire!" The first volley was deafening. 2 rounds hit the lead truck, which erupted into flames. The Germans froze, then chaos. The Stuarts surged forward, guns blazing, darting between plumes of smoke. Jack's tank fired 3 times in 30 seconds. 2 hits, 1 glancing blow. The enemy gunners scrambled to turn their turrets, but the Stuarts were already gone, repositioning. Their engines howled like beasts in the dust. Within minutes, both Panzers were burning wrecks, their fuel convoys destroyed. When the smoke cleared, Jack saw bodies sprawled in the sand, German and British alike, but mostly German. The ambush had worked perfectly. As they regrouped, the radio crackled with Cotton's voice, calm but electric. "That, gentlemen, is how a toy kills giants." The men laughed, exhausted, filthy, triumphant. For the first time, they didn't feel like victims of their machines. They felt like masters of them. But the desert had a way of reminding them that victory was temporary. The Germans adapted quickly. Within weeks, Rommel scouts began using decoy convoys and artillery traps. Air attacks intensified. The desert rats found themselves hunted as much as hunting. The laughter had ended, but the fear hadn't. One afternoon, During a retreat near Bir Hakeim, Jack's unit was strafed by Stukas. The sky screamed with descending bombers. Explosions sent sand and fire into the air. One Stuart flipped over, its crew trapped inside, flames licking at the hatches. Jack and his driver rushed out under fire, wrenching the hatch open with bare, blistered hands. They pulled the men out, coughing and screaming. Seconds later, the tank exploded. Afterward, they sat in silence, watching the wreck burn. The air shimmered, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then the rescued gunner whispered, "Still think it's a toy, Jack?" Jack stared at the flames. "No," he said softly. "It's a teacher." Word of the desert rats' ambushes began spreading through Allied command. American observers in Cairo sent back detailed reports. British light tanks employ hit-and-run tactics with great effect. Morale high despite attrition. In Berlin, Rommel's intelligence officers noted increased harassment from small, fast armored units. Coordination unusually precise. The M3 Stuart was earning a new reputation, not as a tank that could win duels, but one that could win mines. It was proof that in war, adaptation mattered more than design. As March turned to April, the desert bloomed briefly, tiny flowers pushing through the sand like fragile miracles. Jack sat on the hull of his tank, cleaning his gun, listening to the desert wind. His uniform was faded, his skin burnt bronze. The laughter of the early days seemed like another lifetime. The war was far from over. Rumors swirled of a massive German push. The name Gazala was whispered like a coming storm. But Jack felt something new beneath the exhaustion. Not arrogance, but belief. The M3 hadn't changed much. Still thin, still noisy, still underestimated. But in the right hands, with the right mind, it had become something far more dangerous, a symbol of defiance. The desert had tested it. The men had suffered for it. And together they had discovered the truth. A machine doesn't need to be perfect to be deadly. It only needs men who refuse to give up on it. And soon, that lesson would echo across the sands. As the laughter finally died, replaced by the roar of engines heading toward Gazala. The wind carried a taste of iron and smoke. May 1942, the Battle of Gazala had begun, and the desert itself seemed to shake. Dust clouds rose like ghosts over the horizon as Rommel's Afrika Korps surged forward in a crescent formation, engines growling, gun barrels glinting in the merciless sun. The Germans called it Operation Venezia, and they expected it to be another rout, another British retreat across the sand. But this time, something unexpected waited for them. Something small, fast, and dangerously clever. Corporal Jack Havers sat inside his M3 Stuart, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the horizon. His unit, a reconnaissance detachment of the 4th Armored Brigade, was dug in along a shallow wadi northwest of Bir Hakeim. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outarmored. But they had a plan. The desert rats had become experts at one thing the Germans still underestimated: deception. At dawn, the first columns appeared. Panzer IIIs and IVs, lumbering forward in perfect formation. Their black crosses shimmered in the haze, their commanders confident. The British anti-tank guns opened first, sending up plumes of sand. The Germans responded immediately, shelling the ridges, believing they were crushing the enemy line. But beneath that illusion, the Stuarts were already on the move, darting behind dunes, using the smoke and confusion as cover. Major Cotton's voice echoed through the radio. "Remember, gentlemen, we don't stand. We strike and vanish." The M3s accelerated, engines screaming, treads cutting through sand like knives through silk. They emerged on the enemy's flank, firing on fuel trucks and artillery instead of tanks. The first explosions erupted behind the Panzer formation, where the Germans least expected them. The sky filled with black smoke and burning oil. The desert wind carried the scent of victory and vengeance. Jack's gunner fired again and again, each shot sending shockwaves through the hull. The recoil jolted his teeth. "Target down!" the loader shouted. They shifted position, dodging return fire, disappearing into dust clouds. The Stuarts were like hornets, too fast to swat, too many to ignore. One German officer, captured days later, described the scene with disbelief. "They came from nowhere. We turned our guns, but by the time we aimed, they were gone. Then they were behind us again, like sand devils." That morning, the desert became a chessboard of chaos. The Stuarts, once mocked as weaklings, now dictated the rhythm of battle. They harassed supply lines, cut radio trucks, and lured German armor into minefields. Their radios, faster and clearer than the German sets, allowed seamless coordination. Wolf packs, the men called themselves. Each platoon moved like a single mind, striking in waves. For the first time, Rommel himself seemed caught off balance. His armored spearhead slowed, forced to turn and defend its flanks. Every time a panzer pursued, it was ambushed from another direction. Every time a convoy tried to resupply, a Stuart pack descended like vultures. The laughter of 1941 was gone. In its place came frustration and fear. By midday, the temperature soared to 130 degrees. The air shimmered like liquid glass. Jack's tank rattled over shattered ground, shells whistling overhead. "Left! Left!" his gunner yelled. They swung the turret, fired, hit a truck loaded with ammunition. The explosion lifted it into the air like a comet. Jack ducked instinctively as debris rained down. For a brief, terrifying moment they were exposed. A Panzer IV spotted them through the haze. Its turret swung, slow, deliberate, like the gaze of a predator. Jack's pulse froze. Reverse. Full reverse. The driver slammed the controls, the Stuart jerking backward. The German shell missed by a second, detonating behind them. Sand showered the hull. Jack's crew returned fire, 3 rapid shots. The first 2 bounced harmlessly off the Panzer's thick armor. The third, a tungsten round, found the track. The German tank lurched, crippled. Jack's driver whooped. "Got the bastard!" But there was no time to celebrate. Another Panzer appeared over the ridge. "Run!" Cotton's voice barked over the radio. The Stuarts scattered, engines howling. Speed was their only salvation. The heavier German tanks tried to follow but bogged down in soft sand. From a distance, it looked like children outpacing lumbering giants, the very image of irony. As the sun dipped, the desert turned bronze. The battlefield stretched for miles. Smoking wrecks, burning trucks, the twisted silhouettes of war. The M3s regrouped behind friendly lines near Bir Hakeim, battered but alive. Of 20 tanks, 14 remained. Yet their impact had been colossal. They destroyed supply convoys, immobilized panzers, and forced the Afrika Korps to pause, something no one had managed for months. That night, in the flicker of campfires, the men sat silent, exhausted. The sky was streaked with red dust and fading light. Major Cotton walked among them, his uniform blackened, face streaked with grime. "You've just made history," he said quietly. Rommel's armor blinked, and it blinked because of you. Jack looked at his tank, scarred, dented, covered in soot. It looked nothing like the glossy machine they'd first received. It was ugly, battered, and somehow alive. "She's not a toy anymore," he murmured. Reports from the front spread like wildfire. Intelligence communiques described light British tanks inflicting disproportionate damage. American newspapers back home called them desert gnats stinging the lion. For the first time, the M3 Stuart had earned a new name. Not honey, not toy, but the desert killer. Even Rommel's staff began to respect it. One German report intercepted by Allied command read, "Small Allied tanks cause severe disruption in supply lines. Avoid pursuit without air cover." It was the kind of line no one would have believed 6 months earlier. By the second week of the battle, the Stuarts had perfected their craft. They no longer aimed to destroy panzers outright. Instead, they made them blind, hungry, and stranded. At night, they struck fuel dumps. At dawn, they attacked columns moving through open terrain. When daylight came, they melted into shadowed wadis. Each engagement added to the legend. One platoon, cut off for 2 days, destroyed 8 German vehicles and slipped away undetected. Another lured a Panzer unit into an RAF strike zone by pretending to retreat. The coordination between air and armor became surgical. The once chaotic desert war was now a symphony of timing and deception. In one unforgettable moment, Jack's crew stumbled upon a column of half-tracks resting near an abandoned well. They had barely 20 shells left, but Cotton gave the order anyway. "Make them think there are 20 of us." The Stuarts attacked in intervals, 2 at a time, firing, retreating, circling. Dust clouds made them seem endless. The Germans panicked, scattering. By the time they realized there were only 5 tanks, it was too late. The well and the supplies were gone. As night fell, Jack watched tracer rounds streak across the dark horizon like red comets. The desert smelled of oil and death. But for the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel before: hope. The laughter that once followed them had turned into fear. Even captured Germans muttered about phantom tanks and British devils in the sand. The irony was complete. The M3 Stuart, once dismissed as a fragile toy, now haunted the desert like a living myth. And yet, triumph carried a shadow. The toll was immense. Every victory left behind wrecks, burning men, broken machines. Cotton himself grew quieter each night, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something inevitable. The Stuarts were winning battles, but the war was far from over. Still, the transformation was undeniable. In 6 months, a tank the Germans had laughed at became a weapon they dreaded. It wasn't because it grew stronger, but because the men who drove it refused to believe in weakness. By the end of May, Rommel's offensive stalled at Bir Hakeim, where Free French and British forces held firm. The Stuarts circled the battlefield like wolves, harassing, striking, retreating. The once invincible Afrika Korps bled fuel and time. When the dust finally settled, the desert was silent except for the crackle of burning wreckage. Jack stepped out of his tank and watched the horizon glow red under the dying sun. Around him, the ghosts of machines stood still, twisted iron monuments to pride, ingenuity, and survival. The men who had once driven toys had changed the rhythm of war. And somewhere, miles away in a German command tent, someone finally stopped laughing. When the dust finally settled over Gazala, the desert was littered with the skeletons of tanks, British, German, and American alike. The sun rose over a landscape of twisted metal, half-buried treads, and empty helmets staring up at the blazing sky. For the men who survived, victory tasted strange. Part pride, part exhaustion, part disbelief. The M3 Stuart, once mocked as the weakest tank in North Africa, had helped turn the tide. But the men who drove it understood the cost better than anyone. Corporal Jack Havers sat on the hull of his tank, boots dangling over a track scarred by shrapnel. The paint had long burned away, replaced by a dull, sun-baked bronze. The name stenciled on the side, Maggie's Honey, was barely legible. His crew slept in the sand beside it, too tired to speak. The battle was over, but the war still loomed ahead like an endless horizon. Weeks later, the desert rats pulled back for refit. New tanks were arriving from the docks at Alexandria, heavier, deadlier machines like the M3 Grant and the Sherman. The little Stuarts were being reassigned, phased out, or turned into reconnaissance vehicles. Mechanics joked that they'd finally earned retirement, but for the crews who had lived inside them, the thought felt almost personal, like losing a friend that had bled with them. Jack walked through the depot one evening, passing rows of damaged Stuarts awaiting salvage. He ran a hand over one wrecked turret and thought of the men who hadn't come back. For every tank that survived, 2 had burned. And yet, he realized, their sacrifice had not been in vain. They had proven something far more enduring than armor thickness or gun caliber. That courage, cunning, and teamwork could outthink brute strength. News of their exploits had reached London and Washington. Allied newspapers called them the Desert Wasps. The official dispatches praised their bold and unconventional tactics. In truth, it was desperation that had driven those innovations, but history rarely distinguishes between necessity and genius. When General Montgomery took command later that year, he studied their after-action reports closely. He saw in those light tank tactics a doctrine for a new kind of war, one that valued mobility, coordination, and deception as much as firepower. The Stuart, though obsolete, had reshaped British armored thinking. Its lessons would echo at El Alamein in Tunisia and far beyond. Rommel, too, had learned. In his post-war writings, he would admit, albeit grudgingly, that the British small tanks caused considerable disruption and confusion during the desert fighting. It was a rare acknowledgement from a man known for pride. Even the enemy had come to respect the machine they once dismissed as a toy. But the desert does not forgive easily. Many Stuarts were left behind, their tracks snapped, their hulls abandoned where they fell. Over time, the sands began to reclaim them. Wind filled their open hatches, burying them inch by inch. Some still sit there today, silent witnesses to the absurdity and brilliance of men who refused to accept defeat. For Jack, the war did not end with the M3's retirement. He went on to serve in a Sherman during the later North African campaigns, then in Italy. But he always spoke of the Stuart with a kind of fond reverence. "It was the one that made us soldiers," he told a war correspondent years later. "It taught us to survive when we shouldn't have, to think faster than the enemy, to trust each other, not the metal." In those early desert months, the M3 had been more than a tank, it was a classroom. Its fragility forced men to become inventive. The speed demanded nerve. Its limits exposed every weakness and every strength a crew possessed. It wasn't the perfect machine, but it made perfect soldiers. One summer evening in 1943, as he rested in a camp near Tripoli, Jack received a letter from home. His younger brother, who had joined the army back in England, wrote, "They say we're getting the new Shermans. Stronger guns, thicker armor. But I wish I could have driven one of your honeys. You made them sound alive." Jack smiled faintly, folding the letter. Alive, that was exactly what it had been. By the time the war ended, the M3 Stuart had fought on nearly every front, from the sands of Egypt to the jungles of Burma, from the Pacific Islands to the fields of Normandy. Thousands were built, and though technology soon rendered them obsolete, their legend persisted. American crews would later nickname them Little Davids, while the Soviets, who received many through Lend-Lease, called them Fast Devils. The world had once laughed at it. Now it was a symbol of resilience, of daring, of the underestimated striking back. Historians often measure victory in tons of steel and miles advanced. But the story of the Stuart belonged to something smaller, the human scale. It belonged to the men who drove through hell with faith in each other and in a machine everyone else had given up on. In 1945, after the war, Jack visited a museum in London where an M3 stood on display. Children crowded around it, pointing at its small turret, giggling. "It's tiny," one boy said. "How could that fight in a war?" Jack smiled, not answering. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the tank's cold surface. The plaque beneath it read, "M3 Stuart Light Tank, North Africa, 1942. Used by British 4th Armoured Brigade known as the Desert Rats. Speed, 36 miles per hour. Gun, 37 millimeters. Nickname, Honey." He traced the engraved letters, remembering the smell of burning oil, the roar of engines, the laughter in the face of death. So many ghosts lived inside that steel, his friends, his fear, his youth. For a moment, he could almost hear the desert wind again. "They called you a toy," he whispered. "But you taught us how to win." Outside, London bustled with peacetime life. Buses rumbling, radios playing swing music, lovers walking beneath street lamps. The world had moved on. But in that quiet hall, time stood still. The little tank that once raced across dunes now sat in eternal silence, a relic of mockery turned miracle. The irony was complete. What began as a laughingstock had become a legend. History would remember the mighty machines, the Tigers, the Shermans, the T-34s. But somewhere beneath those grand stories ran another current. The tale of a small, underestimated machine that refused to die quietly. The Stuart story was not about superiority. It was about survival. It was proof that even in the most mechanized of wars, it was human spirit that tilted the balance. Years later, when veterans gathered at reunions, they often ended their stories the same way. We weren't the biggest, one would say, raising a glass, but we were the fastest. Another would add, and the bravest. Laughter followed, not the mocking kind, but the weary laughter of men who had earned the right to remember. And as time carried their voices into history, the lesson endured. Strength isn't always about thickness of armor or size of guns. Sometimes it's the will to adapt, to endure, to turn insult into weapon. In a way, the M3 Stuart embodied every underdog that ever lived. Mocked by its enemies, doubted by its allies, it became great by refusing to be ordinary. It outthought the giants that sought to crush it, and it left behind a story as immortal as the desert it once conquered. Beneath the sands of Libya, somewhere near the ruins of Bir Hakeim, a rusted Stuart still lies buried under time's weight, its gun pointing toward the horizon as if still watching for enemies that will never come. The wind sighs through its empty turret, carrying echoes of laughter, shouts, prayers, and the rattle of tracks. Perhaps that's how history should remember it, not as a tank, but as a testament. Because in every war, in every age, there will always be something small and underestimated that changes everything. And the question that lingers, whispered like desert wind across the years, is simple. Which modern machine, mocked today, ignored today, will be tomorrow's Stuart?